Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes. This is Legal Matters, the program that's been designed to address critical issues facing consumers and businesses today. It's legal information, practical solutions, and straight talk about a wide variety of topics that will affect your home and work life. We discuss issues from bankruptcy and family law to Social Security, intellectual property, and more. We have a special guest attorney with us today, but first let's welcome our sponsors from Bazar, Grasso law firm in East Providence, attorneys Jacqueline Grasso and David Bazar, and we will get to Jennifer in a second. So today, a seldom discussed topic, equality and discrimination in our schools, workplace, community, and in public places as it pertains to a specific community, that known as LGBT. We'll go into that. The laws have certainly been changing, and proposals at times have become a political football, and far beyond the single-sex marriage issue, there are many more. Many are in such hot debate, and we'll get into those as well. There are news in the courts, in the news. If you're an employer, a landlord, a teacher, or a parent, you might have said something that was insensitive, but it might have also been illegal. So we need to get along and understand a little bit more about what you need to know. So joining us today is an attorney who is also a community activist. She's a business leader, a nonprofit director, and an advocate for varying groups from elders to artists. So we hope that you will join us in welcoming Jennifer Menudo.
It's good to be here.
Thank you. So let's get to it. Most people know that same-sex marriages is okay, but certainly there's lots more going on in the LGBT community. Why don't you just give us a little background about what that is and what issues are you're facing today?
Sure. Well, the recent victories in passing same-sex marriage is still on everyone's minds and hearts. I think it was a huge victory in Rhode Island last year. So having passed gay marriage last year at this point, we're all adjusting to sort of what that means and what the issues are, and making sure there is a smooth transition with that. Other issues I know that are discussed, a big issue is, as we know, nationwide, is bullying in schools. So I would say, if we were to discuss a topic that isn't same-sex marriage, I think that is the biggest issue on the agenda, and basically educating the community on, on protecting gay youth. You handle advocacy issues as well as legal issues. Do you have young people coming to you now because they need a lawyer, or just because they need an advocate, or both? And where's the overlap, or what do you do? There are people that come. I hear from students in schools. I work with different groups that are advocating for protections for young LGBT people, but also from parents and from teachers who want to understand and learn more about the issues so that they can also help to protect kids in schools. Have either of you had young people come in, or do you have more of the workplace issues that you would have to contend with at this point?
Many years ago, when I first started practicing, I had somebody come in who was subject to a wrongful eviction. It was a gentleman who was going through the sex change process, and as obviously the changes happened throughout the medical process, his landlord started to notice, and subsequently he was evicted. I mean, he didn't say he was evicted for that reason, because there was no smoking gun there, but it was obvious that he was homophobic, and he made nasty comments to the person. So does the nasty comment alone give you the proof that you need to prosecute or to... Yeah, we'd have to file suit for wrongful eviction, and then by the time he came to see me, he had already been evicted. And then it's a question of how far do you want to go with this? Do you want to file suit? So I just gave him some basic background. And I think, quite frankly, I think he had a good case. I do.
So in the course of my practice, there have been a number of issues that I could address that are germane to this topic, starting with what you were talking about, bullying. Now, in just a generic issue, bullying has always been a problem and is continuing to be a big problem and top of people's minds today. We do Law Day through the Bar Association, and it's been topics that we've covered. And when we cover that, oftentimes we speak with the students and they raise issues. And in East Greenwich, I've been involved in a couple of conversations with people at Folks and some groups that the students have formed to try to protect each other against bullying and to speak up and don't let the bully bully you, and don't stand by and not do anything about it. And it can be just because people are mean and bullying, and they bully because, as you say, based on someone's gender or their sexual orientation. So these are all things that we've dealt with through that. Just interestingly enough, at the very beginning of the conversation, you talked about the impact that we're still starting to understand about the Marriage Equality Act. And so one of the impacts is, in Rhode Island, we can now do divorces.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so I've handled some, and one very recently, and there are new issues that you have to think about as we deal with that. One is that my client had a child during the marriage, and of course the other mom wanted to also have custody and visitation, and so the judge was very careful to make sure, is she on the birth certificate? Well, there was an adoption, so she is on the birth certificate. And how else can we protect her rights? And now the child was born during the marriage, so there's a presumption in Rhode Island that if a child's born during the marriage, it's a child of the marriage. And so, of course, we want to argue that that still applies during, the same-sex marriage. So, but it's, like you said, it's a number of things that you may not have specifically thought about, but that come up, and now we deal with them. And they're fun, exciting, actually, for me, because I love the law, topics to think about and deal with.
That's exactly right.
So you're an advocate, and as one, what might you do? And then Jackie and David, you are both lawyers, and in certain other arenas, you are judges too. How do you, at what occasions do you have to advocate and explain how to, or train people to handle situations better and not do something illegal or insensitive?
I think we as lawyers can do just what David said, is just educate other lawyers to spot those issues.
Lawyers.
Yeah, definitely educate younger lawyers. I mean, the Defense of Marriage Act is still on the books, even though President Obama issued a general order, an executive order saying that the federal government doesn't have to enforce it. But there's still an issue of filing joint tax returns, and whether or not the federal government will allow a joint tax return of a married couple of the same sex. So that's still an issue too, and that's something that we have to think about as well.
And I think based on the Windsor case and cases that follow that line, that the Defense of Marriage Act is going to get eroded and cut away judicially, if not by legislation over time. They cut it away in Windsor with pensions.
Yes, the Windsor case was a landmark case from last year, and the Supreme Court ruled that those federal protections apply to same-sex couples who reside in states where marriage equality has been passed, or same-sex protections and state laws have been passed. So currently there are 17 states that have passed what we call gay marriage, same-sex marriage, and growing. There are other states that have bills up. But the Windsor case was so important because it started the process of the erosion of the Defense of Marriage Act, which was found unconstitutional in certain provisions, and really opens the door now to federal rights being given to same-sex couples that are able to marry in those 17 states. Of course, it's complicated because there are states so convoluted. There are states that still, as we were talking about earlier, have proposed constitutional bans.
33
states. So if a couple marries in one state, and moves to a different state, wants to divorce in that state, I mean, the laws vary so much from state to state.
Well, and we had that in Rhode Island with before Marriage Equality Act. Someone married in Massachusetts moves to Rhode Island. The court made a very poor decision, I think, of saying that you couldn't get divorced in Rhode Island, which flies in the face of Full Faith and Credit Act and all of those things that say, well, the marriage is legal where it occurred. We have to recognize it and allow the divorce to go through. We're not saying you can get married here, but you certainly should have been able to get divorced here. So if these other states take the position that it's not legal and so forth and so on, I can see their courts doing the same thing that our court did at that time, which is to really put people in a terrible position of being married and unable to get divorced.
That was the Chambers v. Ormiston case, exactly. And the case basically said, decided that the family court did not have jurisdiction to...
It also looked to the definition of marriage.
Yes.
Right. And what they did in that case was they said that at the time the family court was created, which I think was like 1969 in Rhode Island, that type of marriage didn't exist, so they couldn't have been talking about that being a subject matter for divorce. But of course, that's not what the issue should have been. The issue should have been is, are these people, the two people who are before you, legally married? And if they are, it doesn't matter what our definition of marriage is, it's what their legal status is.
That's full faith and credit.
And then full faith and credit should have applied.
Let's go back for a moment, because I'm not sure that we defined what LGBT stands for. It is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender.
Exactly.
Is that it? Okay. I know there are enough acronyms that are associated with it. So let's move forward, or actually let's move backwards for a moment. When you started to talk about students and bullying, there's certainly a learning curve, and an issue that comes up when someone's dealing with, I'm not sure whether I'm female or male. Two things that I've been reading about. One, simply what happens in a gym. I'm a boy, I think I'm a girl, I want to be in that side of the playground, and I want to be in that side of the changing room. How does that person get to be treated fairly, and how does the other sex feel that they're being treated fairly? And secondly, what about financial aid? As I understand now, this issue is impacting on that. How do you fill out those financial aid forms? You are female if you think you are, or if you think you aren't. Explain that a little bit. Two issues.
These are issues where so much work still needs to be done. We've made so much progress in the LGBT community on the L and G side, even the B side. But getting to these issues that involve transgendered people, we are still really behind. I mean, and I think the main thrust of the argument is education, education, education. And we can speak to, I know, Jackie and David have been practicing a long time. They may or may not have seen over their decades in practice issues relating to transgendered people, but I know from a community standpoint and a legal standpoint, we have so much work yet to do, and there are still many cases that you see where violence,
So I actually have had an interesting case with the transgender situation. The young lady, now the young lady, came to me and wanted to change her birth certificate. So we filed a petition in probate court. I brought all the medical evidence in, including the operation that was complete and all of that, and the judge granted it, and so now her birth certificate reflects that she's a woman.
Does she have to change her social security number too?
No,
No.
because she's still the same person.
Same person.
So she changed her driver's license because the driver's license said male, so that needed to change. But the identification, social security, her bills, her utility bills, the name had changed to reflect her new name, but the person's still the person. And I suppose she didn't change the number. She probably filed information maybe like you would do when you get married and change your name with social security. The number stays the same, but your identification changes with the name.
And what do you do if you're filling out a financial aid form, applying for financial aid for college? Some of those questions are absolutely black and white, and you may not have made a decision yet whether you are one or the other. What happens with that? What do you suggest that people do?
I think, again, we're still in the infant stages legally of trying to address these issues. It's certainly, the next phase of this human rights, campaign. And I think if you ask me what would I advise someone to do, I mean, I'm a more progressive thinker, so I would advise someone to do what they feel and then push the issue legally and let the courts take it up, which that's, how we make progress on these, human rights issues and have throughout history.
So if it's a checkbox, it's a little difficult, but if you're still biologically, physically a male, even though you feel like you're a woman, right, check mark male and say for now.
Yeah.
And what about the gym? I want to play with boys. I think I am one. Okay, on the basketball court, perhaps not an issue. What happens at the very practical level where I'm sure most schools haven't had an occasion for them to retrofit the changing rooms? Is that the next step that has to happen to adapt to this changing environment so that that girl could be feeling safe going in whichever direction, and so could the rest of her peers or his peers?
I really think the biggest conversation is about education. I think that educating our community, educating ourselves, educating our schools, and letting all of the the pieces filter into all areas of our community life is what needs to happen. Again, we're sort of in a nubile stage of seeing how these these things play out. We know that there's an enormous amount of discrimination. We know that there are many instances of violence, and we all are aware now of the widespread bullying. Can only imagine how isolated a child or a young adult feels to be in that situation and to not know what to do, and then even to approach, a guidance counselor, a teacher, a principal, maybe even a parent, and how difficult that is. So it's all of our responsibility.
Yeah, well, I would think that the school system would have to afford them the opportunity to be protected. Not the opportunity, they have to afford protection. Yeah.
And so I totally agree. It's an educational thing for many of these issues. For some of the legal issues, I think for now it is somewhat black and white. If you're still biologically, your birth certificate and all the other things say you're a male, I don't think you're going to play on the girls' basketball team. There is an example, though, of somebody who went through the process, changed, and went back to college and played on the girls' basketball team and was actually very good. I remember seeing it on maybe Sports Center or on ESPN or something. And there was an issue. Should that person be allowed? And I think at that point in time, he went through everything to become she. She was now a woman, and that's what her birth certificate, I assume, would have gotten changed to say. She should have been allowed and was allowed to play on the girls' basketball team.
That's right. Well, it seems obvious that people know sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. It's plain wrong. However, I still read in numerous occasions, Jackie cited the one about where someone lives, but in a restaurant, in other public group community facilities, that there could be some sort of discrimination in open public areas. Do you address that legally? Do you just address that as just an education issue at this point? What do you say to someone?
Yeah.
Certainly both. They go hand in hand. Yeah, I mean, I think if someone is if there's an incident, I would bring a cause of action.
Right.
For sure. And how would you do that? How does that happen?
Well, there are a number of ways you can do it. Massachusetts has a Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, so if you are filing a constitutional argument that someone was discriminated, you have to first go through MCAD, and then at some point you do have the opportunity to remove it to either state or federal court. If it's going to state court, you're citing the state equal protection laws, and if you're going to federal court, now you're looking at federal issues. But Rhode Island does not have a commission against discrimination. Oh, we do. Yeah, Rhode Island does have a commission against discrimination.
Yeah, and you do the same thing. You file your complaint, they investigate, they can give you a letter to sue if you want, and you go forward and bring your suit.
Could you help provide those resources? Is it the Human Rights Council in Rhode Island that would be a starting point?
Yeah, the Commission on Human Rights. They have a website. Massachusetts has a website as well, and there's a wealth of information there for people to read.
And in the workforce, as it's happened, when you see that there might be some discrimination, sometimes it might be very subtle, sometimes it's blatant. How do you go about documenting such before you would have to see a lawyer or the commission?
Keep good records. Yes. Keep a journal. Dates, times, places, incidents. Keep a journal. Yeah.
And would it be smart to go to the HR person first or write to a lawyer? Because if you go to an HR person, maybe you might save your job. You're not supposed to be fired if you were to make such a statement, but in the real world, sometimes
well, if somebody's being discriminated, they do have to let the employer know that they feel that he or she's being discriminated, because if they have no knowledge of it, where's your cause of action? So you at least have to put the employer on notice, and they have to afford you certain protections. And if they don't, if it continues, now you do have a discrimination case.
Just to take a hypothetical, which is actually an old case that we had many years ago, we had a fellow who worked at one of Rhode Island's larger, back then, tech companies. And he was gay, and his co-workers harassed him nonstop. And I don't know if you remember these motherboards that go into computers used to come into these little plastic sheets that protected them, and they did things like make puppets and had slogans and things on there that were terrible. And he complained to the employer, and they did nothing about it. And it got to the point where he needed to get psychological help. He was unable to work anymore, so we filed two things: a workers' compensation case, which are very difficult for mental stress. But there was a physical manifestation, not being able to eat, stomach pains, basically developing an ulcer. And he won his comp case, and there was also a discrimination case that was brought. and the employer ended up settling both of those cases with him for a large sum of money because they did nothing after being told repeatedly about what was going on to protect him.
Can you shed a little light on the subject about the employer? If I read that these laws only apply if you have 4 or more employees, there's some sort of caveat if you happen to be a religious organization, there's some exemptions. Can you shed some light on what that's about these days and how that's coloring what you need to do?
Well, I think if you're a small business, I don't care if you have 1 employee or 1,000 employees. The law is the law. If you're going to if there's discrimination and it's a small company, it doesn't mean that because it's a small company that person has no right to sue.
The employer could still be.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
There are certain things in the law that come into play in employment, you know, for FMLA,
Yeah.
certain size business, and those types of things. Workers' comp, which we talked about in that last case, you used to be 2 or more employees in Rhode Island. It's just if you have an employee, you have to have workers' comp and workers' comp insurance to cover them. You're in the system. Some of the discrimination things may have some numbers in them, but the bottom line is there's always a cause of action if you're an employer and you don't do something to protect an employee that a lawyer will find and bring against you.
This is all fairly new territory, but when there are cases, do these become long, protracted cases too that drag on, or are they something that are usually are they cases that are usually settled
I don't know.
without a court or with just a judge, not a jury?
They take
How
a
does that work?
while, especially discrimination cases or employment discrimination. They take a while, they do.
So beware, you're in it for a long haul when you do this.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't scare people from going that route.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
it's an important, those are important steps to take. And no one, deserves to be discriminated against, and no caveat gives an employer or entitles an employer to discriminate. So we've made tremendous strides. I think from a community perspective, again, I'll say it not as as a lawyer, but as a member of the LGBT community, we've made enormous strides over these last even few years. I think the community feels very excited about having educated, we talk education, but the fruits of all of that labor have really come to be evident in some of the marriage equality laws. And so it's no time to rest on any laurels, but it's a time to celebrate that we are making progress as a community, as a region, and as a country toward the better end of it's good too.
It's interesting because one of those law day things I talked about when we talked about civil rights, and it was Brown versus the Board of Education and all of those struggles that went through the 60s and continued for some degree or another today. The question I asked to the students is, where do you see the next horizon, the next frontier for civil rights? And it was in these issues that they all immediately recognized it and were able to make the connection to what had gone on before.
Absolutely. I just saw the Butler, the wonderful movie The Butler, the other night, and as I was watching it and watching so much of the civil rights movement, I was thinking the same thing.
The parallels.
The parallels between the movements, and it's so striking and moving. And I do want to mention also that even though we've made these strides in the last few years, it wasn't before decades of work on behalf of so very many brave people who were speaking up before, when it was dangerous to speak up, and in many cases it's still dangerous to speak up, and that's why we do what we do. But we've made strides, but it's after a long time of efforts.
It certainly seems with increasing awareness has come certainly a greater degree of awareness and understanding, and certainly have a long way to go. But while there seems to be progress, as you're pointing out, there's certainly very hotly contested issues. And one I think that, since it's been in the news nationally, probably is worth addressing. A federal prisoner wanted a sex change operation. Brad Manning wanted to become Chelsea Manning. And people have a right to make that change. Yet here he is in a federal prison, and the state, who's paying for that? And should that be something that the public should be responsible for, even though he feels that he needs to make that change? How do you address that being fair to both sides?
We were just talking about it.
We were talking about that. Well, they can't deny him his right to do that. And what ultimately happened in that situation is the state paid for it. he was allowed to go through the change.
Yeah, see, I have a little bit of an issue with that in the sense that he would be absolutely entitled to do that if he wasn't in prison because of something he obviously did that was criminal. If he had resources of his own while he was in prison, I probably wouldn't have any problem with it at all. But to make the state pay for something like that, that's non-life-threatening, I guess. That's just I have a little bit of an issue with that.
And one closer to home, in Massachusetts, there was not a federal,
was a state.
but a state
Yeah.
issue, and this person's probably closest to having the deed done, having the
Yeah,
operation
the
done.
state's paying for that.
Yes, Robert wanted to become Michelle.
Correct.
He killed his wife,
Yeah.
and he had already been undergoing, I guess at his own expense or their expense, some of the drugs that are required in the beginning. Now he's
Right.
in a place to be an inmate, and now he wants to have that taken care of, and it looks like the state is going to fund that. And as you read on, some of the impacts as they impact on the rest of the security of the other inmates, because whether it's harassment, whether it's bullying, their safety. So many of these topics that you're bringing up in the schoolroom or in the classroom is actually being visited on this prisoner too. So should we end up finding a new way to fund this, or should we not? It certainly is. I understand why it would be a hotly contested issue, and probably would
You commit a crime, you kill somebody, you give up certain rights. So,
No, you don't give up your constitutional right.
but do you have a constitutional right to have the state pay for an
That's the
operation?
issue.
Yeah.
And that's where I may draw the line a little bit on that. I don't know. I think if you kill somebody, you don't get the benefit of making the state pay for that. I mean, give me treatment if I'm going to die from a disease. That's required. But you have a constitutional right to life, liberty, and happiness, I guess, is something like that.
Yeah.
But you give up your liberty rights when you kill somebody. So I think you may give up some other rights, too.
Brad Manning didn't kill someone, though,
I'm
right?
talking about your
Different
guy
story.
from
Exactly.
Massachusetts.
Yes.
The only thing I would contribute, and I understand, is that to go through the process of actually changing gender. For me, if I stop and think about it like this, and it's easy to do, is so compelling, so complex, such an investment of every part of what we, of a human being. Not to mention so expensive.
Right.
To do it, there has to be such a compelling
Right.
feeling inside of already being in prison.
And I
think.
support somebody's right to do that.
Yeah.
I just don't know if I support that right to make the
Public funding.
state fund it when you're in state custody because you killed somebody.
One of the many issues that we have to deal with. I think that certainly having these discussions, while we're having them here, hopefully they'll be having more in other places too, and it'll be going on across the country in various states, at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. So I guess at this point what we need to do is pretty much wrap this up, and we want to once again thank attorneys Jacqueline Grasso and David Bazar, and our special guest, Jennifer Menudo. We thank you for tuning in, and we hope you will stay tuned as our discussion of legal matters will continue.